So there's three things that I want to run through in this lead off, and it is going to be about half an hour, I reckon. First, I want to run through a history of socialist feminism. I then want to move on to consider some of the challenges to socialist feminism, and then finally, I want to make a case for socialist feminism in an era of ressentiment, which is French for resentment. I want to make a case for socialist feminism in an era of ressentiment. And I'm going to start by giving you a quote by a woman called Wendy Brown, who I'll tell you a little bit more about later. And she says this. She says, "The late modern liberal subject quite literally seethes with ressentiment." So we're going to return to that a little later, okay? But just remember that quote. So let's begin then with a history. What is socialist feminism? So there are basic defining arguments of socialist feminism, which are one, that sexual difference, gender roles, gender relations, and the sexism and oppression of women that arise from these. They're not fixed in biology, they're not inevitable, but they're socially constructed and embedded within the structures of our society. And the other point is that oppression that is experienced by women in our society is particular, is distinct vis-a-vis capitalist social relations. Class and sex oppression are intertwined and interdependent, and therefore the liberation of women and the emancipation of the working class go hand in hand. So feminism and socialism have a long history, and socialists from the beginning have been interested in women's rights. So feminism and calls for women's rights formed a central part of the first socialist movements in Europe at the beginning of the 19th century. So with the Owenites in Britain, the Fourierists and the Saint-Simons in France, they argued that women's exploitation within marriage, where she was economically dependent on and socially subordinate to her husband, was the result of the interests of private property, intruding into personal relationships. Women were married for their wealth, on the one hand, if they were from the upper classes, or for their reproductive and domestic services, on the other hand, if they were from the working classes. They were treated, therefore, as in both cases, as a form of private property, and they were subject to sexual and social control from their husbands. So early socialists argued that the emancipation of women is actually crucial to the freedom of humanity, and that women actually can't be truly liberated without an end to private property. Now, in the late 19th century, Friedrich Engels, in The Origins of the Family, Private Property and the State, which he wrote, or certainly published in 1885, he attempted to trace in detail the emergence of women's oppression, and he looked at the development of human civilization from earliest societies, and he argued that women as a subordinate sex, women became a subordinate sex, along with the emergence of private property, inheritance traditions, and the division of labour. Now, it's worth saying that there are details of his analysis that have been criticised in light of more recent research, but I think what's important is his approach. And what I mean by that is he analysed the position of women in terms of changing material conditions that shape this, not simply in terms of abstract rights and wrongs. And actually that approach, I think, is crucial and still important to socialist feminist analysis. Now, these basic socialist feminist ideas were developed and, more importantly, put into practice by, notably, the German social democratic women's movement at the end of the 19th and early 20th century, and the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, whereby women began to organise in the workplace to fight for rights as workers and to demand equality under the law and state provision from the government. And as part of both of these movements, the position of women and their struggle for emancipation was widely discussed in the labour movement and socialist parties. Now, the next point at which socialist feminism re-emerges as a significant force was during what's known as second wave feminism. So we're talking about the late 60s and 70s. Second wave feminism gave rise to renewed efforts to build a socialist feminist movement. And socialist feminists aimed not simply to superficially incorporate a new mass women's movement into the wider working class and the wider working class struggle, but to use their experiences in the women's movement to transform and improve socialism, so to build a new kind of feminism and a new kind of Marxism as well. Socialist feminists were sharp critics of fellow socialists. They wanted to move away from what they term mechanical Marxism, a reductive economic analysis of class oppression that focused on the male workplace, the conventional political sphere, as the only possible and significant site of struggle. Within such analysis, every other part of experience and social existence, for example, education, sexuality, recreation, art, music, housework, family, were peripheral to the central dynamics of class. That was mechanical Marxism. So in contrast, socialist feminists argue that because capitalism, in its search for markets, penetrates every nook and cranny of our society and our social and cultural existence, actually capitalism affects the housewife that might never have entered formal employment just as much as the so-called factory worker. So class struggle isn't simply about, although it, largely is about wages and hours and workplace issues, but it's not simply about that. Also, within other arenas, classes conflict. Women are bombarded with advertisements from the beauty industry telling them how to look, feel and behave. When that happens, they're also experiencing capitalist oppression. So it's this belief that things like sexual identity, self-image, the division of labour within the family are actually valid issues for political discussion and action that lay behind the socialist feminist definition of the slogan, the personal is political. Socialist feminists argue that problems faced by women on a daily basis, whether the husband did the washing up, whether they enjoyed having sex, whether they felt themselves failures because they didn't conform to conventional standards of beauty, these weren't simply personal issues that they had to overcome individually or put up with. They're also political issues that are embedded within capitalist social relations. But socialist feminists also wanted to build a distinctive kind of feminism. So in that sense, they criticise radical feminists who believe patriarchy to be the primary form of oppression, and that the oppression of women in all societies throughout history is down to patriarchy in the main. Now, Sheila Rowbotham noted that of this, patriarchy implies a universal and ahistorical form of oppression which returns us to biology. It does not carry any notion of how women may act to transform their situation as a sex. Socialist feminists argue that although women have been oppressed in pre-capitalist societies, their oppression under capitalism is distinct and therefore it needs to be analysed according to particular historical conditions. Capitalism, as well as oppressing women in new ways, has also crucially brought women into the workplace, providing them with economic independence, an opportunity to discuss their position with other women and to organise to change that. So central to the programme of women's liberation is that it needs to take into account the conditions capitalism's created and use these conditions that capitalism's created to fight against that system and the sexism that's embodied in it. Socialist feminists also argue that sexism can't be separated from the struggle against capitalism, so in that sense they criticise liberal feminism. Campaigns to allow women to become heads of corporations isn't going to do anything to help the majority of working class women to raise a family without decent childcare provision. Campaigns focusing on women's rights centred around the figure of the habit-all middle-class mum. Socialist feminists said, well, look, this ignores and excludes the working class women upon which this mirage of liberation depends, the nanny, the cleaner. So that's a history of socialist feminism. I want to move on to challenges to socialist feminism. And I want to raise 3 challenges to socialist feminism. Socialist feminism, which is a way of understanding the world and a way of engaging in meaningful struggle. So there are 3 challenges that I think are worth thinking about. The first is, what do we think about the concept of patriarchy? Now, in our Workers' Liberty pamphlet, The Case for Socialist Feminism, An early pamphlet of ours, we make the following still pertinent point in this pamphlet. We say, women have been oppressed for thousands of years. Possibly they resisted the beginnings of oppression with violence. For sure, individual women have always kicked back and stood up for themselves, but the programme of women's liberation dates from capitalist societies. Capitalism continued the oppression of women, but changed it. Now, central to our programme for women's liberation is an understanding of the distinct conditions of existence that have been generated by capitalism. But I think there's explanatory power to integrating into our analysis of the social inequalities of gender a particular concept of patriarchy. Patriarchy that is defined as structures of male status and power over women, which are often pre-capitalist but actually survive into capitalist social relations, that are often pre-capitalist and or religious, which have actually come to fuse and collide with capitalist social relations and forces. So let's think of some empirical realities. The anti-abortion movement in America, the stark variation of violence against women across the world, the prevalence of organised sexual abuse by networks of British Pakistani men. All this indicates to me an intersection, a fusion, and a collision even of capitalism and patriarchy. That's one challenge. Second challenge that's come from, outside socialist feminism, and actually inside as well, to be fair. And this has been put forward by many feminists of varying radical and left-wing stripes, particularly during the 70s. And it's this idea that Marxist theory was unable to incorporate an analysis of gender oppression because it was sex-blind, or rather it concerned itself with the working class, which it assumed was male, and struggles solely in the workplace. So there's a definitive essay that was published in 1981 by Heidi Hartman called The Unhappy Marriage of Marxism and Feminism. And it is one of the best critiques of this time of Marxism from a feminist viewpoint. And she argues the following: the marriage of Marxism and feminism has been like the marriage of husband and wife, depicted in English common law. Marxism and feminism are one, and that one is Marxism. Recent attempts to integrate Marxism and feminism are unsatisfactory to us because, as feminists, because they subsume the feminist struggle into the larger struggle against capitalism. So, in other words, the argument here is Marxist theory wasn't up to understanding the full range of oppressions that exists in the world, which the new social movements in the late 60s and the 70s, have shown to be oppressions that are just as vicious as oppressions related to class. And I think on this point that an open and honest and frank reflection is absolutely critical. In their internal document, British Perspectives 1977, the militant tendency, forerunner to the Socialist Party, which is a sizeable and significant party and socialist force on the left still today. The militant tendency, now Socialist Party, defined the feminist movement as petty bourgeois dominated and subject to, I quote, hysteria. The militant tendency in the 80s was a particularly bad example of the Marxist left in terms of their generalising and elevating of the class, posing a simplistic formula of socialism is the answer, insisting that certain issues are a distraction from the real enemy of capitalism, and all in all, pandering to sexist and homophobic attitudes amongst layers of the working class. We don't have to look that far back, actually. Take also the relatively recent case of the SWP and the appalling kangaroo court dealings of allegations of rape by a leading party member. So the point here is an ongoing struggle to challenge sexism and the lack of democratic space on the left to engender a healthy, dynamic socialist feminism. Well, that, yes, is absolutely essential. So third challenge to socialist feminism that's been born from what is known as privilege theory and intersectionality, a new wave of identity politics. For those of us that remember the last wave, you could call privilege theory and intersectionality post-identity politics, or identity politics on steroids. Peggy McIntosh, who is the architect, the kind of the key pioneer, if you like, of privilege theory, says this, and she says this about privilege theory in 2014. What I believe is that everyone has a combination of unearned advantage and unearned disadvantage in life. We're all put ahead and behind by our circumstances, by birth. The key thing is to let people testify to their own experience. So the basic premise of privilege theory is that wherever there's an oppressive system, be it capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy, heteronormativity, there's both an oppressed group of people and a privileged group of people. Intersectionality is connected because it's this idea that we're all privileged by some systems of oppression and we're all burdened by others, well, maybe not all of us, and some of us are burdened by other systems of oppression. Therefore, our privileges and our intersections intersect. And there's this argument that if we lack full awareness of our privileges and their intersectionality, we're politically divided and weak. So whilst we might not be able to be held responsible, we might not be held responsible for the systems of oppression that impart privilege on us, we actually have a choice. The argument goes in how we respond to our privilege, how we respond to maleness, straightness, whiteness, ableness, and so on. So there's a critique here that I think is worth making, which is this. Privilege theory, privilege discourse, privilege talk seems very much to me to be based on unchanging status. It's this fixed entity, right? Privilege, married up with identity politics, rather than a dynamic and fluid understanding of human consciousness as it evolves through human history. Privilege theory sees society as a seesaw. You're up there because I'm down there, and you're up there because you're weighing me down. So it's a very personalised dual camp perspective on social relations. It's a me versus you with the various intersectional combinations. That's actually devoid of independent class politics. It's devoid of a tangible critique of capitalist social relations. Privilege theory as well seems to me to produce an impasse. And what I mean by that is, well, let's just take the example of the deadlock that exists between a body of trans activists and a body of radical feminists, and the vitriol on both sides that, frankly is going nowhere. And where's that come about? Well, it seems to me that this impasse has been produced by, on the one hand, a camp of people that are insisting that those born into biologically male bodies carry privilege, regardless of their identification as women. Privilege over women who have an entire lived experience of being women and of its related oppression. So that's camp one, radical feminists, right? On the other hand, we have a camp of people arguing that there are those who are cisgendered, whose gender aligns with their sex at birth, who carry cis power and privilege. Privilege over those who have a lived experience of being transgendered, whose gender doesn't align with their sex at birth, and of its related oppression. And when you set politics up in this way, where's the dialogue? Where's the alliance? It's a competition of who's the bigger victim, who has the bigger hurt, who's carrying the bigger pain, who has the bigger wound. And I'm going to come back to that. Intersectionality, again, on the critique of this politics, intersectionality has some merits, but it applies a generalised cultural and economic understanding of capitalism and class. So when you try and grapple with how class is being defined, it's very broad. It's quite cultural. And I really question what is lost in intersectionality's implicit redefinition of class via this thing called classism. So class is, classism alongside sexism, alongside racism, alongside so on. If we redefine class like this, what does that mean when we think about the nature of oppression and exploitation and the means of resistance? Because for me, fundamentally, class is not primarily another structure of oppression. Class fundamentally is a relation of exploitation. For those of us around the room that are reading, have read Capital by Karl Marx, or read any, have any understanding of basic Marxist politics, class is a relation of exploitation. It's not fundamentally a structure of oppression. in a way that racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia can be understood as oppressions. Moreover, racism, sexism, homophobia, they're all individually distinct forms of oppression, so you can't actually lump all of them together either. They're individually distinct forms of oppression that have individually distinct relationships to capitalism, and these features include specific and universal features, and there's a real danger with intersectionality in sliding into a conceptual collapse. So we fail to distinguish what's specific about class, racism, and so on. So we slide into this conceptual collapse through this kaleidoscopic series of intersecting structures of oppression. And with this focus on the personal and the specific, there's no room for universal truths. There's no, you can't find your way towards a universal truth. And the net effect of that is there's no way out. You can't think through resistance with privilege theory and intersectionality, not easily at all. You can't think through resistance. How do we change society? How do we liberate humanity? So I'm going to come to some conclusions, and I'm going to return to that quote at the start by Wendy Brown. Let's just read it out again. The late modern liberal subject quite literally sees with ressentiment. So I've recently been reading a rather fantastic book that was written, it was published in 1995 by an academic called Wendy Brown, called States of Injury, in which I think she touches upon something that is so pertinent to the present moment within feminist politics, and she's coming at it from, I think, a really good socialist feminist perspective and critique, and it just resonates. So I want to read out some of the quotes and just see if it resonates for you too. So she starts in this book making the following really astute observation. She says this, and I'll unpack the quote. She says, "Freedom has shown itself to be easily appropriated by liberal regimes for the most cynical and unemancipatory political ends." So she's really thinking about, well, what does freedom mean? Okay, so she's saying, liberal regimes, capitalist societies, government states, it's been appropriated, it's been taken away from us. And she says, look, the dream of democracy meaning humans might govern themselves by governing together, is difficult to distinguish in this proliferation of demands, claims of rights, protections, regulations and entitlements. She's not saying people demanding rights, protections, regulations and entitlements isn't important, but she says, where's the dream of freedom, of governing together as humans? And she says, what you have, in contrast to a Marxist critique of the social whole and Marxist vision of total transformation of society, she says this: to what extent does identity politics require a standard internal to existing society against which to pitch its claims, a standard that not only preserves capitalism from critique, but sustains the invisibility and the inarticulatedness of class, not accidentally, but endemically? Could we not have stumbled upon one reason why class is invariably named, but rarely theorised or developed in the multiculturalist mantra of race, class, gender, sexuality? She's calling people out. She's calling out a body of academics that have given up on this notion of freedom as total transformation of society, and all of us being able to, as humans, govern ourselves by governing together. She's calling them out and saying, what you're pushing with identity politics, is something that, leaves capitalism intact, and that's not good enough. And she continues, because she's got some deeper stuff to say about identity politics. She says this: politicised identities generated out of liberal societies, they're premised on exclusion from a universal ideal. So politicised identities, so you can think about, various kind of claims from minority oppressed groups in society that we know about today. She says their identities are premised on exclusion from a universal ideal. They require that ideal, as well as their exclusion from it, for their own continuing existence as identities. Which is a really powerful point. And what she does as well, she goes on, she applies Nietzsche's notion of ressentiment, which is why I'm talking about resentment in French, because, you know, she applies Nietzsche's notion of ressentiment as a key feature of contemporary identity politics. So she says, she explains, and this is how Nietzsche understands it, and she applies it, and she says, look, ressentiment in contemporary identity politics is a triple achievement. It produces an effect, rage, righteousness, that overwhelms the hurt. It produces a culprit responsible for the hurt, and it produces a site of revenge to displace the hurt, a place to inflict hurt as the sufferer has been hurt. So she concludes. She says, look, where do these historically and culturally specific elements of politicised identity's investment in itself and in its own history of suffering, when does this come into conflict with the need to give up these investments, to engage in something about Nietzschean forgetting of this history in order to pursue an emancipatory democratic project? She puts it much more simply, actually, later on in the book, and she says, what if we sought to supplant the language of I am, with its defensive closure on identity and its insistence on a fixity of positions and its equation of social with moral positioning? What if we supplanted a language of I am with a language of I want this for us? Which seems to me, you know, just the right spirit of socialist feminism that we need in a period of which I think, identity politics is very, very much on the resurgence. So I'll leave it there.